by the nationalist movement during the Spanish Civil War and during Francisco Franco's dictatorship. White Terror Taiwan, the period of political repression in Taiwan starting in the 1940s by the Republic of China government. White Terror, Greece. Persecution of the elites between the Treaty of Versailles in February 1945 and the beginning of the Greek Civil War in March 1946. White Terror, violence of the white troops during and after the Finnish Civil War in 1918. White Terror, mainland China, the period of political repression in in 1927 by the Republic of China government. And the Shanghai massacre of 12 April 1927, sometimes called the April 20 incident, was a violent suppression of Communist Party organizations in Shanghai by the military forces of Jiang Jieshi. And conservative factions in Kuomintang, following the denouncing Jiang Jieshi on April 13, and thousands of workers and students went to the headquarters of the 2nd Division of the 26th Army to protest. Soldiers opened fire, killing 100 and wounding many more. Jiang Jieshi dissolved the provisional governments of Shanghai, labor unions, and all other organizations under communist control, and reorganized a network of unions with allegiance to the Kuomintang and under the control of Liu Yeshen. Over 1,000 communists were arrested, some 300 were officially executed, and more than 5,000 went missing. White Terror Taiwan. In the period, around 114,000 Taiwanese were impressed during this period, of which about from 3,000 to 4,000 were executed for their real or perceived opposition to the Kuomintang government, led by Jiang Jieshi. Most actually persecution, though, take place in 1940 to 1952. Most of those persecuted were labeled by the Kuomintang as bandit spies, 就是匪谍。 meaning spices for Chinese communists and punished as such. The Kuomintang imprisoned most of the Taiwan's intellectual and social elites out of fear that they might resist Kuomintang rule or sympathize with communism. For example, the Formosan League for Emancipation was a Taiwanese independence group established in 1947, which the Kuomintang believed to be under communist control, leading to its members being arrested in 1950. The World United Forces for Independence was persecuted for similar reasons. However, other persecutions did not have such clear reason. In 1968, Bo Yang was imprisoned for his choice of words in translating a popular comic strip. A large number of the white terrorists, other victims, were mainland Chinese, many of whom owed their evacuation to Taiwan to the Kuomintang. Often, after having accompanied to Taiwan, these refugees to Taiwan were considered more disposable than local Taiwanese. Many of the mainland Chinese who survived the white terror in Taiwan, like Bo Yang and Liao, it's very famous, moved on to promote Taiwan's democratization and the reform of Kuomintang. Then we'll talk about the white terror during the Cultural Revolution. Yeah, the revolution was launched in May 1966. Mao thought that bourgeois elements were infiltrating the government and the society at large and to restore capitalism. He insisted that this reversion needs to be removed through mass movement. It's like that. And in August, this is a very famous Mao's big cultural poster. Name is "Bombard the bourgeois headquarters." Yeah, you can read it. China's first Marxism Leninist big cultural poster and commentators' article on it in the Minribao, People's Daily, are indeed suitable writing. Comrades, please read them again. But in the last 50 days or so, some leading comrades from the center down to the local levels has acted in a diametrically opposite way, adopting the reactionary stand of the bourgeois. They have enforced a bourgeois dictatorship and struck down the surge movement of the Great Cultural Revolution of the proletariat. They have, this is a big character poster. They have stood facts on their head and juggled black and white, encircled and suppressed revolutionaries, sniffed out opinion different from their own, imposed a white terror. But be careful, he used the white terror. And felt very pleased with themselves. They have puffed up the arrogance of the bourgeois and deflated the morale of the proletariat. How poisonous, viewed in connection with the white deviation in 1962 and the wrong tendency of 1964, which was left informed, but writing insists, should at least make one wide awake. Yeah. So here, I mentioned the work teams. Yeah, the work teams that were sent out and instructed by Liu Dengist consider the current mass movement merely a new version of the 1957 anti-racist campaign, during which hundreds of thousands intellectuals were labeled as racists. Many of them just raising criticisms towards their direct party secretaries, though his daughter Liu Pingping and Liu Shaoqi personally gave instruction to the work team that was sent out to the #1 middle school attached to Beijing Normal University, where his daughter studied. Liu Shaoqi said that in the range of country, the enemies to be touched should at least be 5%. But according to his daughter's report of her school, Liu Shaoqi said that enemies in the school could be far more than the baseline of 5%. Consequently, more than 90% of cadets in the school were labeled as ghosts and monsters and black ghosts, 就是女鬼蛇神、黑帮什么的。77% of class advisor was struggle with. By turning the work team stage as white terror, Mao differentiated himself from Liu Dengists on the issue of how to run the Cultural Revolution. For Mao, to actively support the mass movements on its own initiative was to serve the interests of proletariat. In an opposite way, Liu Dengists' plan of running the Cultural Revolution never included extensive mobilization of the broadest masses, even though it was hard for the party bureaucrats to control the situation. Single-handedly, the Liu Dengists would mobilize some loyalist masses to fight against the rebel masses. Many of them were forced to do labor reform. Some of them were even harshly beaten. Deng Xiaoping also personally supervised the Cultural Revolution in the middle school attended by his daughter Deng Rong. Deng Xiaoping set the targets of a struggle at the school as ordinary students and teachers, even instructing people to struggle against the parents of the targeted students. Bian Zhongyun was a deputy principal at the experimental high school attached to Beijing Normal University in Beijing, China. She became the first victim of the Cultural Revolution in August 1966, when she was beaten to death with wooden sticks by her students, who were led by daughters of high-ranking officials. Consequently, in the first 50-odd days after the work team were sent out, they were waved off white terror, Mao's description. Widely striking the whole country, work teams recklessly imposed control of the mass movement. Outspoken people were accused and labeled by work teams as rightists, bogus leftists, true rightists, and even counter-revolutionaries. Many activists were in their way jailed or even counter-revolutionaries. Many activities were in their way jailed or even compelled to commit suicide. According to statistics, in the first 2 months of the Cultural Revolution during White Terror, 10,211 students were as rightists, and 2,591 teachers were designated as counter-revolutionaries by work teams at just 24 universities in Beijing. There are many more universities in Beijing, under the instruction of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Therefore, the work team leader sent to Wuhan University asserted that the Cultural Revolution would be a higher stage of the anti-rightist movement. In line with it, the work team and its successor, the Cultural Revolution Committee of Wuhan University, branded 232 teachers and staff members as black guns, 黑帮, and being part of the Black Line, 黑线, within just 4 months. This represented 19% of the total 1,242 personnel on campus. 108 countries ranked higher than the vice secretaries of the party branches and the deputy directors of teaching and research sections were relegated to black guns, which accounted for 38.2% of all candidates in the university. In the Chinese department, 36 out of 63 staff, 18 out of 19 senior cadres, and all 5 secretary of the party branch was labeled as black guns and being in the Black Line. Among the rest of the personnel in the department, none were reprimanded, forced to make self-criticism, dismissed from important positions, or even were put under supervision and house arrest. In the university, more than 150 persons were deprived of voting rights and their rights to be elected. In Gansu province, the work team forced the targets of criticism and struggled to study researches how to be a good communist, but refused them access to Muslim Maoist work. In addition, even though the CCP Central Committee issued a circular in forbidding the local authorities from reducing the wave of those being struggled against, the work team in Wuhan University continued to reduce their waves for more than 3 months. The Cultural Revolution Committee of Wuhan University even sent more than 200% to the so-called labor reform camp, set by the work team. In the same city, Xiao Weiye, a young teacher at Moshuihu High School in Wuhan, together with some teachers and students, put up wall posters to discuss the suppression of student movement in June 1966. The work team quickly designated these young people as counter-revolutionaries. All the major activities in the high school were put in jail. Some of them were even sentenced to the death penalty, and the three youngest students, aged 16, were sentenced to 3 or 5 years imprisonment. In Lanzhou, the capital city of the western province of Gansu, under an atmosphere of ruthless struggles and merciless blows,残酷斗争，无情打击。张朝仁, a student of Lanzhou University, was driven to suicide by throwing himself at the moving train. A female student, Kuan Momo, jumped from a building, resulting in being injured. Zhang Haiyan, a student in the Chinese department, was almost beaten to death. The scope of attacks in Lanzhou University accounted for 32.3% of the total 5,000 or so personnel on the whole campus. In Xi'an Communication University of Shanxi Province, more than
It was more than 300.
Yeah. More than 300 countries were dispatched to take control of the campus movement by the Shanxi Provincial Party Committee. The work team claimed that there was 10 to 15% ghosts and monsters on campus. Under the ruthless suppressions of the power work team, 4 people committed suicide and 2 of them died. The deceased were charged as suicide with crimes, and hence branded by the work team as counter-revolutionaries. For example, Lu Yanfu, a low-ranking cadre who followed the Liu Deng's nun at the early stage of the Cultural Revolution, and Xiao Yanpan, bystander, after the 11th plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of the CCP in August 1966, recollected. At the beginning of June 1966, the Gansu Provincial Party Committee sent a work group to Lanzhou University. On June 7, 1966, students with different positions put up posters debating the role of the University Party Committee. The work group supported one faction and suppressed another. Some suppressed students sent a telegram to the center to report the situation, for fear that the students would demonstrate on the street. The Gansu Provincial Party Committee formed a bigger work team this night. By morning of June 8, the work team repeatedly broadcasted that all people who already opposed the work group or sent telegrams to Beijing would be designated as counter-revolutionaries. White Terry ranged on campus. After stationing at the campus, the work team started to form the Cultural Revolution Committee. At first, it was called as the leading group. Later, it was renamed as the Preparatory Committee of the Lanzhou University Cultural Revolution Committee. All departments, sections, and offices established corresponding organizations. Similar cases happened every day. In the entire country, in the work team dominated period. Due to work team's ruthless persecution, cases of suicide were reported everywhere. Even though the post-Cultural Revolution regime never disclosed the statistics, the death toll caused by work team under the instruction of Liu Dengst could be counted in tens of thousands. The persecution naturally widened the distance and caused a grave tension between work teams and their targets, which unsurprisingly aroused people's revolutionary air toward work teams and their behind-the-scenes bosses in the top leadership of the CCP. Mao was so outraged by the expression that he wrote a famous big character poster to condemn the work teams and the instructor from the center to the local authorities. It read, Mao's bombard the headquarters by big character poster was released among 12 leaders of the CCP in Zhongnanhai, Beijing on August 5, 1966. In this poster, Mao mainly accused the Liu Dengst of making white terror among the masses and the historical righteous and deviation conducted by Liu Dengst in 1962 and 1964. Under its influence, the 11th plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, which lasted 12 days from August 1st to 12th and included representatives from the right guard, finally adopt an official program for the Cultural Revolution on August 8. This is the decision of the CCP Central Committee concerning the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which later came to be generally known as the 16 points. Yeah. So the main idea is, although someone called the violence happened during Cultural Revolution, white terror. In fact, most of them are white terror. Yeah. So.
Hi, my name is Ryan Costello. I'm going to be presenting a paper by Dave Pugh. First, I just want to mention this, I'm not going to read the whole paper, I'm doing a presentation on it. It's about 50 pages. If you're interested in reading the whole paper, or you have comments about the presentation, you can email procoCul@riseup.net. If you want that email address, you can see me afterwards. I'll provide you with it. Oh, put it up a little higher, sorry. It's called, yeah. No, of course, sorry, I didn't realize it wasn't. Is that a little better?
Yeah.
Okay. So the starting point of this paper is that Mao Zedong's most important contributions to the world revolutionary movement is the understanding of the necessity for class struggle in social society against capitalist voters and the leadership of the CCP, also referred to as revisionists, in Mao's leadership of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76. And there's two brief notes here. Revisionists are those who revise the lessons from previous revolutionary experience. They are those who advocate, for example, for a peaceful transition to socialism, just as much as they are for those who call for the party to command and for the masses to obey. The question of revisionism isn't just exclusive to China, but pertains to all historical moments. Of course, when referring to revisionists, specific revisionists under socialism in China, they're being called capitalist roaders as well, because they're advocating for breaking from the socialist road and going to capitalism, restoring capitalism in China. So capitalist roaders were those in China who sought to restore capitalism through, for example, focusing politics on economic planning and solely on planning, such as Liu Shaoqi, and those who called for the end of the Cultural Revolution in the name of putting everything in order, as Deng Xiaoping did, and especially those who defended the privileges of the party members over members of the masses. And this takes multiple forms, from local authority, political power, to wage differentials and other forms. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but it's important to lay this out up front. This revolution, that is the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, in a socialist society was an attempt unprecedented anywhere or any time prior to it to mobilize and empower hundreds of millions of workers, peasants, women, youth, intellectuals, and minority nationalities in order to embark on and stay the long and difficult socialist road to communism. This is because socialism is not reducible to state capitalism or some metaphysical and static form of the state. It is rather a transitionary period, a dictatorship with a proletarian class character built around, this is the key point, the dialectical unity of the dictatorship over the bourgeoisie and the democracy of the masses. If you just have dictatorship over the bourgeoisie, it ultimately defaults into a Stalinistic terror incapable of promoting mass participation in politics. During this transitionary period, there is necessarily a protracted working through of contradictions aimed at the destruction of the valued form and the elimination of oppression on the road to communism. But communism is a stateless society, and thus cannot be achieved in one country, but must rather be realized the entire world over. This is the question that lies at the heart of this paper. What sort of foreign policy is needed under socialism to advance the class struggle on a global scale and work towards communism? And because of the primacy of internal contradictions, how is this foreign policy a reflection of the class struggle in a socialist society? The primacy of internal contradictions, I'll mention it at the end too, but if you have any questions about that, I highly recommend you refer to Mao's 1937 essay on contradiction. Part A of this paper explains how the class struggle in China developed and came to a head between 1971 and 76. I'm going to go through a few points there. Again, describing what's written in the paper. There's a much greater detail in the paper itself. The socialists knew things developed and expanded in both the first stage, that is 66 to 69, and the second stage, 69 to 76, of the GPCR. One of the most important revolutionary transformations was narrowing and overcoming class differences and inequalities in socialist society. Throughout the GPCR, Mao and his political allies explained that in the People's Republic, there were significant differences in education, cultural level, technical expertise, wages, and differences between rural areas and the cities, differences between men and women, differences in access to political decision-making power. All of these differences needed to be overcome, and there was a need to do this in a protracted manner. This can't simply happen overnight. Just because you have state power, it doesn't mean these are solved. They have real basis in reality, and objective reality, and there's a need to intervene and work through them. And of course, it has to happen through mass initiative. The party doesn't have the answers for how to solve all these in all these particular instances. This is all relatively basic and elementary, but again, it's important to put it forward, as so often in academia today, the verdict on these is reversed. Important revolutionary transformations were, sorry, I jumped ahead. The Maoists stated that addressing these great differences required continuing the revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this revolution under socialism, the working class and its party exercises dictatorship over the bourgeoisie. In socialist China, the bourgeoisie were the capitalist voters in the CCP and the PLA leadership, again, not all of them, but the capitalist rotors amongst these forces, those who sought to maintain and or expand the privileges of the few over the masses. This is an important difference prior to the seizure of state power and the establishment of socialism, when the bourgeoisie owned the means of production. Mao in 74 really pushes the question, what did Lenin mean by dictatorship over the bourgeoisie? Because of course the objective conditions in China were vastly different under socialism than they were prior to it. So, sorry, jumping back in. From 66 to 76, the proletarian dictatorship, that is working class rule, enabled hundreds of millions of people in China to employ democratic and empowering methods to transform and revolutionize society. Important revolutionary transformations were made in the late 1960s and continued into the early 1970s by the forming of worker study teams, making challenges to feudal and Confucian ideology, forming Iron Girls brigades to break into sectors of work that were traditionally done by men, spreading collective values, internationalism, extending healthcare throughout the countryside, promoting mass involvement in key theoretical questions, and revolutionizing culture by means of model works that featured heroic male and female workers, soldiers, and peasants. The central political issues in socialist China of the early 70s were whether to uphold and extend or roll back and reverse the socialist new things of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Well, revolutionary transformations of the Cultural Revolution were not universal and met stubborn resistance from revisionist forces in the CCP and PLA. It is the politically advanced experiences of the GPCR that are most important to understand and uphold today. These lessons are important for politics today and for the future of revolutionary efforts to establish and sustain the dictatorship of the proletariat. Sorry, give me one. Mao and his political allies, who could be attacked as a gang of four only after Mao's death, fought to defend and extend these socialist new things. Who were the four? In the 1967 storm in January, the proletariat took the political stage in the GPCR. The seizure of power from the capitalist rotors in Shanghai was led, under Mao's overall guidance, by Zhang Qingqiao, the new CCP secretary in Shanghai, by Yao Wen, the national leader in the field of propaganda, by Wang Hongwen, the 39-year-old chair of the Revolutionary Alliance of the Shanghai proletariat that took the form of Workers' General Headquarters in late '66, and by Jiang Qing, the leader of revolutionary cultural work in the PLA and the CCP. These four worked closely with Mao and other socialist rotors to continue the advance of the revolution under socialism and to spur mass participation in the revolutionary struggles, and to combat the capitalist rotors like Deng Xiaoping, who sought to restore the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in China. That's really key. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is the class character of the state. It's not an opposition between dictatorship in China and democracy in the West. And the question is, if the class character of the government and of the state is bourgeois, then it's a bourgeois dictatorship with democracy only for a few and dictatorship over the many. This is an elementary Marxist point which shouldn't come into question at this conference. And so that also means that it's not a question of whether the police are armed or not. In the UK, the police aren't armed in the same way they are in the US, but it's still a bourgeois dictatorship. As the second half of the paper explains, in 1969, the Soviet imperialists massed 1 million troops, nuclear-armed bombers, and medium-range missiles on China's northern border. This situation led Mao and the majority of the CCP leadership to make an opening to the West, to avoid fighting two imperialist superpowers at the same time. There's a need to maintain the dictatorship of the proletariat to hold on to the gains of revolution against the constant threat of imperialist aggression. At times, this can take the form of a tactical alliance with one capitalist or imperialist power to avoid invasion by another. However, it also opens a revolutionary power to the danger of revisionist forces' efforts to forge a strategic, which is different than a tactical, alliance with imperialist powers. This was clearly the case in China, where the opening to the West strengthened the hand of an emerging revisionist group of the CCP and PLA leaders who were eager to support US-backed regimes and oppose the Maoist forces' efforts to promote revolutionary struggles around the world. What's more, these revisionists often justified their support of the US's foreign policy by the metaphysical claim that the USSR was the dominant imperialist power at the time, and that therefore any regime that opposed the USSR was good. This is effectively parallel to what's called tankyism today. Those who support regimes like Assad in Syria, Putin in Russia, the current regime in Iran, and many other oppressive governments around the world, on the grounds that their opposition to the US makes them a positive force in the world. This sort of metaphysical dualism of good and evil is diametrically opposed to the concrete investigation called for by Mao in Marxist politics in general. It is also important to note that these revisionists in China said that the Cultural Revolution should be brought to an end and that China had to buy advanced weaponry and technology from the West, which was primarily justified by invoking the threat of the Soviet Union as an imperialist power. The next important step in the emergence of the new coalition of revisionist forces took place in the fall of 1971 after Defense Minister Lin Biao attempted a coup d'etat. Lin argued that the PLA should command the party, as opposed to the party commanding the gun, that history is made by heroes and geniuses, which is antithetical to the Maoist understanding that it is the masses that make history. And, for related reasons, Lin opposed the opening to the West. Lin's position could have led to simultaneous attacks on China by the US and Soviet imperialists. This would have been the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat in China and stopped any advance towards communism. Lin had cultivated an extensive network of supporters in both the CCP and PLA, including the PLA chief of staff. After his death in 1971, many of Lin's allies in the CCP leadership were replaced by high-ranking cadre who had been overthrown or demoted during the early revolutionary upsurges of the GPCR. Zhou Enlai presided over this process of rehabilitating these revisionists who made limited or no self-criticism. Many of these revisionists had been set aside during the early years of the Cultural Revolution because of their reactionary opposition to and repression of the Red Guards and other revolutionary forces, some of what we saw with the White Terror just in the previous presentation. When these revisionists did make self-criticisms, they were self-criticisms in name only, as was shown by their subsequent actions supporting the restoration of capitalism in China. One of the extremely negative results of this process was that Deng Xiaoping, the original #2 capitalist roader, was called back from internal political exile in March 1973 to serve as Zhou's deputy premier. This also gets at some of the stuff that Abby was talking about the role of the army being very different in the late 70s as opposed to the early 60s, where a number of the army members in the early 60s played a positive force in supporting leftists. But by the end of the Cultural Revolution, or towards the end, there was a large number of rightists in power. Beginning in 1972, Premier Zhou Enlai led a campaign to reverse the revolutionary transformations of the GPCR, beginning in higher education. This campaign undermined efforts of the Maoist forces to combat the division of mental and manual labor that is constitutive of capitalist social relations. From 1973 to 75, Deputy Premier Deng Xiaoping worked on a 10,000-word program for capitalist restoration in China. In January 1976, under Mao's leadership, Deng was removed from all his leading posts in the party and the army. However, Deng did not stop preparing his forces in the CCP and PLA to take action against the four after Mao's death, as obviously we now have seen. When the decisive confrontation took place between the Maoists and Deng's forces in October 76, the capitalist roaders staged a military coup d'etat in Beijing, wresting the four by surprise. The four had a strong political base in Shanghai, Beijing, and a number of other major cities in the provinces of Zhejiang and Shandong, and the CCP departments of education, propaganda, and culture. However, after the dissolution of independent mass organizations, they were waging an uphill battle to relaunch the revolutionary upsurges nationwide through spurring mass initiative and promoting mass supervision of the party and PLA. The four were defeated mainly because of the strength of the capitalist roaders in many leading bodies of the CCP, and especially in the leadership of the PLA. The lightly armed Maoist workers' militias in Shanghai and other cities were no match for the regular forces of the PLA. This military coup allowed Deng and his reactionary allies in the CCP and PLA to implement their capitalist road of setting up a state capitalist regime, which has grown into today's system of imperialism with Chinese characteristics. This experience of class struggle in the People's Republic in the early 70s has handed down a rich legacy for future generations. This is discussed in pages 20 to 24 or 20 to 22 of the paper, but I'll go through a few key points here. I'm sorry, just another sip of water. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the means by which the great majority of society can have and exercise real political rights and take an active role in transforming social relations towards the elimination of the conditions of possibility of oppression and inequality, which is another way of saying towards communism. Against Stalin's view, this shows that there is class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat, and thus a need for mass participation in politics. In order to sustain and promote mass participation in politics, there is a need to encourage the masses to criticize the mistakes made by the party, mass organizations, and other members of the masses. This can serve as the basis for revolutionizing both the party and mass organizations. The dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be reduced to the functioning of various state apparatuses, or it will lose its proletarian political character. Instead, it must be suited to the political needs of the conjuncture. Thus, at times it is necessary for a large number of party cadre intellectuals to be set aside, that is removed from their roles within the party or the university and sent to learn from engaging in productive labor with the proletariat and studying revolutionary theory. I think that the reality is that it's the education system in China, as was mentioned by William Hinton, was by and large the Western education system. You see today in academia an extreme amount of decadence and distance from the concrete reality of class struggle of oppressed people. That is to say, many academics take a petty bourgeois or a bourgeois stand in politics, and there's a need to get away from this. If we're talking about the lessons of the Cultural Revolution for today, I think there's a need to ask, what role can academics really play? What stand can academics take? Now, that's my question. That's not a question that Dave lays out in the paper, but I think it's relevant here and now. Sorry, jumping back in. At other times, there is a need for mass influxes into the party, especially during periods of acute class struggle such as the Cultural Revolution. There is a need to combat the division of mental and manual labor throughout society. This necessarily entails mass supervision of the party, but also workers' study groups, education and class struggle and education, society-wide struggle over culture, and a dialectical relation of theory and practice in education, as we saw from the beginning with the workers teaching students in the machine classes and so on. In many ways, paralleling the development of domestic class struggle, Mao and his allies continued to support people's war and national liberation movements in the early 70s, while Zhou and Deng developed and put into action the pro-US and counter-revolutionary three worlds theory. This struggle between the Maoists and revisionists is discussed in detail in Part B of the paper, as there are important lessons concerning foreign policy for today's revolutionary and anti-imperialist movements, both prior to and after the seizure of state power. And this gets to the key point that Cultural Revolution is not just an object for historical study, but political lessons are there for the present and after the seizure of state power and establishment of another dictatorship of the proletariat. Another sip of water, and sorry for the delay. A few key points to conclude. The internal contradictions in China were the primary reason for the restoration of capitalism, but the external factors played an important role. In order to understand this, take Mao's example from his 1937 speech on contradiction. At a certain temperature, an egg changes into a chicken, but at no temperature can a stone change into a chicken. So the external contradictions play a factor, but the internal are primary. Again, a simple point, but one that's often forgotten. However, we can see that the internal line struggle in China played out over foreign policy, as well as other things. Zhou, Deng, and Marshal Jiangning pushed for the support of various US-backed regimes, whereas Maoist forces in China constantly tried to support revolutionary politics and national liberation struggles abroad. Unfortunately, due to the limited influence they had in the Chinese foreign ministry, as well as other contradictions in China, the Maoist forces were often on the losing side of these line struggles. Now, obviously, that does not mean their line was incorrect. You can be on the losing side of the line struggle and have the correct line. Zhou and Deng supported many of Henry Kissinger's foreign policies, including supporting Pinochet's coup of Allende because of Allende's affiliation with the USSR, providing military and economic support to Holden Roberto's FNLA in Angola, reversing China's support for revolutionary struggles in the Middle East, and shifting instead to supporting reactionary regimes like the Shah in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Kuwait, reversing support for the struggle for the liberation of the Palestinian people, and instead supporting Israel's right to exist, providing economic support for the Ceylonese government to assist in the suppression of revolutionary movements there, and supporting the oppression of present-day Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, by the reactionary forces in West Pakistan. What is stunning is that these reactionary policies put forward in all of these instances were justified by reference to the threat of Soviet imperialism, as if US imperialism wasn't an equal and perhaps even more threatening force to all national liberation struggles and revolutionary struggles around the world. What's more, this was incredibly disorienting to Maoist and revolutionary forces around the world, who looked to China as the most advanced revolutionary power in the world, and yet also saw support for oppressive regimes backed by the United States. This led some to mistakenly conclude that Soviet imperialism was the primary enemy of all people in the world, even when even more so than the imperialism of the country in which they were living, say in the US or in France, where certain Maoist forces or Maoish forces thought that Soviet imperialism was more dangerous than French imperialism or US imperialism domestically. Of course, if you're living in the United States and you're a person of an oppressed nationality, your primary enemy is going to be the US state on a daily basis. But again, this foreign policy led to a lot of this confusion. In all of these cases, there was a strong opposition by Maoist forces in China to these reactionary foreign policies. For example, Maoist forces repeatedly tried to send military supplies to the Communist Party of the Philippines, but reactionaries in China collaborated with the US to intercept these shipments before they arrived. The Maoist forces also waged intense struggle against Zhou and others in cultural and ideological realms, writing numerous articles and even implicitly targeting Zhou in the Criticize Lenin, Criticize Confucius campaign. Despite the fact that the Maoist forces in China ultimately did not succeed, there were many important lessons to be learned, both from their failures and their successes. This is a key point that Mao makes on practice. It's a basic point, but don't get up if you fail. Take a serious assessment of your failures and your successes, learn from them, and carry the revolution forward. If you can't, look at past revolutionary sequences, see what they failed, see where they succeeded, and put that into practice now. In particular, the key lesson is that class struggle continues under socialism and that foreign policy is a key point in the class struggle. Socialism is not an ideal form of the state in the metaphysical sense of perfection and harmony. It is rather the dictatorship of the proletariat that facilitates mass participation in politics and seeks to promote revolution around the world. Above all, it works towards the abolition of the value form and the creation of communism. In this paper, Dave methodically examines some of the key points of struggle internally and externally in revolutionary China, and I would highly encourage you to read it. It contains valuable lessons for all who seek to put politics in command in the present. Thank you.
Okay, if we could have all the panelists please come up front here to address any questions. And again, we ask that as much as possible, people use the microphones because I think for our broadcast, it helps for people to understand what's being said. You guys just want to go through questions or something?
This is for Ryan. What's Dave's last name?
Dave Pugh.
Can you spell it?
P. Sorry, P. Yeah. Is that the? Sound good.
I don't have a.
And just make sure you know, we had the camera cut off right here, so you're not on camera. Is that okay?
The question I have is on the aspect of the last point you made about the internal being primary and inside the Chinese Communist Party, the battles that went on and the structure of the party. What's people's opinion up there about how the party got to that point? What were the structures of the party or the aspects of the party that brought it to that point?
I can start and try to provisionally answer something. So it's a very complicated issue. The first is that it's something that Fred Angst talks about in some of his writing, and others have too, the wage differentials that's been mentioned here between the party members and the average working person. I think there's a real need to look, and Fred mentions this in some of his writing, to look to the Paris Commune, see the lack of wage differentials between elected officials and average people. Of course, there's also a system of various other forms of political privilege that allowed the certain members of the party to accumulate political decision-making power that the average member of the masses couldn't enjoy. But the reality is that a lot of this is quite complicated and would entail much more detailed, in-depth study.
If I could also answer briefly, I think there's an importance in really grasping the changing nature of the primary contradictions that the party and the Chinese people face more broadly, whereas a lot of people joined the party, for instance, in the anti-Japanese period, during which there was a need for a united front of all the classes, including members of the national bourgeoisie, who saw the basis for proletarian leadership against the Japanese, for the liberation of the Japanese people overall.
Liberation of the Chinese people.
So
it's liberation of the Chinese people.
Yes, and that some of them actually didn't realize that after the founding, or didn't agree after the founding of the Chinese liberation of the Chinese state, 1949 that that contradiction was shifting actually, and that some of them didn't grasp the need for continuing the socialist revolution against all forms of oppression, including particularly against emerging members of a bourgeoisie in different forms. So that nature, the importance of grasping the changing circumstance, I think, is very important then, and it's important now as well, as there's different things on the table in China as well as globally right now. So it's a brief answer.
I would like to add that when Marx talked about socialism as a transition from capitalism to communism, during this period of time in a highly developed country, highly developed capitalistically, there's a gradual diminishing of commodity production. That means exchange based on equal value. But in an underdeveloped country, mostly agriculture, and you cannot abolish the commodity production. Actually, you have to promote commodity production. You also cannot have one kind of ownership of production. You have to have a collective for the agriculture and state-owned for the industrial sector. And these two sectors also have to exchange. And those exchange also commodity exchange. So when we talk about during the social transition, there were capitalist elements. These are the capitalist elements, because if you have commodity production and commodity exchange, and in fact, you have capitalist relations of production. So also, the party reflect the whole society. So we're talking about dictatorship of the proletarian, so you have a party, instead of the proletarian themselves, you have to have a party represent the proletarian. And I really doubt, even though as much advance as China made during a very short period of time, but you cannot expect a class to mature within a very short period of time. So it takes time to become mature. So it takes time to really change. I mean, all the other, so we cannot say socialism is good unless we can answer why, if it's good, how come it cannot be continued? So we have to answer the question, why the capitalists took power. So I think this is very important, and we can address this question in this conference.
Just one more thing on that point. What you said reminded me, it's a really good point about the reflections within the party being, the struggles within the party being reflections of the social contradictions within society, and the value form, the capitalist relations of production. There's a dominant tendency within America, and especially amongst rightist historians and bourgeois media, to say, oh, this is all about individual power struggles. So really, there's a need to get away from that. Mao was always very clear. It's a dialogue that he had in the August of '68 with the Red Guards, sort of about the question of the continued existence of the Red Guard organizations. And he said to them in this dialogue, it's available online if you search for dialogue with the persons responsible for the Red Guards, something like that. He says to them, some are saying that the social struggles in society are a reflection of struggles within the Central Committee, but it's the other way around. The struggles in the Central Committee are reflections of the struggles in society. So I think that what you were saying, what's been said, is really good to grasp that.
We have a question from someone on the internet. The question is to the panel, how should Maoists today deal with the ecological crisis?
I just would say briefly that I don't think the ecological crisis can be seen as separate from the class struggle itself. Of course, it's an objective condition, but it does not affect everyone equally. Particularly, there's a class dimension to how members of proletariat, the masses, have a more difficult time, obviously, than people who have capital and power to relocate, to find different professions of economics. Sometimes it's portrayed as universalism, which actually suits bourgeois ideology overall, as if we're all the same and experience reality in the same way.
As far as I'm concerned, unless the system, the capitalist system, can be reversed, can be struggled against, you really cannot resolve the ecological problem, because in many of the environmentalists in the world, they emphasize on how the environment being polluted and so forth. But there's not much discussion on how the pollutant being distributed among the developed country and less developed country. We know if you have one country producing so much consumer goods to ship to all over the world, the clean product go out and the pollutant remain. And so that's a basic question about a underdeveloped country wants to develop under imperialism.
I'd like to throw out the question of, I think I'm representing Progressive Labor Party's philosophy or idea about the failure of national liberation movements in general. China is the biggest example. We have a failure in Vietnam where capitalism has also been restored. You had further back in history, we have the 100th anniversary of the rebellion in Dublin, where the Irish people thought they could even align themselves with imperialist Germany. It's all throughout history. For the last 100 years, we've seen national liberation struggles where the proletariat aligned itself with its own national bourgeoisie has failed universally. I don't think you can point to one success story in 100 years where that, I know a lot of people think that's a wild idea, but I just throwing it out there for people to consider. And with the fact that the Chinese, under the New Democracy period, had a firm alliance with the national bourgeoisie that would cooperate with them, and capitalism existed side by side with socialism in China, is one of the basic reasons why the Cultural Revolution was defeated, why socialism led to failure in China.
So that's a really simple reductionist and empiricist point, totally antithetical to Mao's need, push to understand actually the concrete situation and not just apply a dogmatic understanding of capitalism. I mean, socialism is not some pure form or mode of production separate from capitalism, as has been pointed out by members of this panel. It's a transitionary period where there is capitalist relations of production and contradictions that need to be worked through. What's more, your dismissal of past revolutionary struggles and national liberation struggles as abject failures because simply they've been defeated and now capitalism has been restored is just empiricism as well. It fails to concretely analyze past revolutionary sequences and see what their successes were and what their failures were and learn from them and put that practice and those lessons put those lessons into practice in the present.
I think you are probably mistaken to say that workers and peasants align with the national capitalists. Workers and peasants align with each other. The national capitalist was just a united front. And it was very clear after a certain period of time, their property will be bought and it will be all incorporated in the social system. As I said, I don't think you can say China failed in this revolution because it succeeded to a very significant point, and the rest of the third world country who decided to let the national capitalists to lead to national liberation, they failed. They were trying very hard that we're going to have an independent capitalist regime, independent of the imperialism. So they have so-called import substitution policies to fend off the foreign capital. But they were, in the 1980s, one after the other failed because they couldn't. I mean, the capitalist class in itself, especially today after globalization, the capitalist class itself, their interest is to ally themselves with the international capitalist system. They are not looking at their country, especially today, as a national liberation as their priority goal. Their priority goal is how we are going to flourish to cooperate with the international capitalist system.
I just want to say two quick things first about the question in reference to Paolucci's just remarks. So the first is that I think it's important to understand concretely what it meant to push the bourgeoisie out of certain places in the course of the Chinese Revolution. It was actually strategically done. I recommend Frederick Wakeman's article in, I think it's Dilemmas of Victory, to give you a sense of how careful the work was done in Shanghai, for instance, which was a complex system of modern city in which there were certain relations of production which cannot instantly have been transformed, in which there was a need to learn from what was being done before simply taking it over. And the process was very successfully done with the achievements we've heard earlier today in healthcare, in terms of women's relations, the elimination of disease and such could not have been accomplished without that care. But in that clarity, though, that this was primarily the proletarian revolution was in command, and politics were in command at that point. In reference to just the previous comments, I differ slightly in saying that I think the primary aspect right now, in terms of, say, the capitalist class in China, is not its relationship with the international bourgeoisie, but we need to see, actually, there are real differences and rivalries among different capitalist formations, especially in leading countries such as China. I think that these contradictions are important to appreciate.
I would like to give credit to the national liberation movements because of the centuries of colonialism and imperialism and what they were up against. So there was a time, I think in the 40s, when the Asian and African newly independent countries, when Roosevelt pushed the Brits to let go, and the French and the Dutch, etc., that there was a chance for a bigger socialist bloc between Asia, Africa, and the Soviet system. But it's so complicated when you're up against the military might and economic forces and all the assassinations of all the regimes. So I would say we've lived through that period and we've learned. And I think you can sense globally that all those lessons out there is, China's published the book on the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. And so there's a new formation happening now. And the IMF just created the new basket of currencies, which will dilute the US dollar, the petrodollar. And I think the renminbi is going to be like $50 trillion US dollars worth in the IMF basket. So I'm just saying there's a reshifting, and all the force, a military force at the imperialism's military might is now facing alternatives. I mean, we have the ability to communicate now with the internet, et cetera, the kind of work that Peter's going to be doing in a couple of weeks. So I just want to not diminish the effect of all the national liberation movements, because they continue. And I see the younger generation picking up the lessons of what the olders went through. So you study white terror, you know what it is, you can recognize it when you see it happening. And, I just want to put in there that we shouldn't let the difficulty of rising up against the forces that we face overwhelm us, because it can be discouraging, right? So if we don't pass on the lessons to more people and younger people, it's going to seem pretty bad. But I don't care how many stealth fighters Lockheed Martin makes, they can't do anything now. Or even the aircraft carrier, the nuclear aircraft carriers are vulnerable. So I just want to not give in to this thing that the socialism is gone. So, for example, if you don't have a socialist bloc economy, and I'll shut up, is that Cuba, North Korea, China, Iran, or whatever, if the U.S. led blockades prevent trade from happening, you couldn't have the socialist bloc with the production and the trade and the exchange. There was some, like Vietnam and East Germany, okay, etc. But we wouldn't be here if Anne had not, and Deng Ping had not put us all together. So I just don't want to leave it with the sound that the national liberation movements failed, because obviously history moves on. Yeah.
Can I say something about this? I'm maybe the least qualified in terms of knowledge of history. Okay, well, all right. I'll try to be read then. Anyway, I think that I can understand the concept about the national liberation struggles turning into something that the mass of people who were participating in them and sacrificing their lives for them were not looking for. I mean, I don't think that the people in Vietnam who were fighting against the U.S. imperialist forces there wanted to see Coca-Cola factories. That's not really what they were fighting for. So I think it's legitimate and important to look at that critically, and it shouldn't be. I don't think it's simplistic to do that or dismissive, reductionist. I think just as the papers that you were talking about from David Pugh, what's his name, made it very clear in the midst of all these extremely complicated, contradictions inside of contradictions and so forth. It's very important to keep coming back to what's the most important one, and the thing that we all, I think, respond to in the stories and the line and so forth from the Cultural Revolution is that you have to keep class struggle primary. That the national contradiction of this part of the bourgeoisie against that part, or so forth and so on. Okay, those things are all going on, but the main thing is that the working people are being screwed, and we have to align with the working people or be part of the working people, and that's primary, and I always have to keep that central. What's that?
Just add one word. I think we have to distinguish between defeated and failed, because bourgeoisie revolution also were defeated a few times before they eventually, overcome and won.
Thanks to all the people up there right now. I think all of your talks were really great. I had a question, maybe relating more to the concrete situation in the United States. It's my opinion that Maoist politics are the way forward for the left in the U.S. and the way to actually concretely realize proletarian power here. And I wondered if the panelists could talk more about the challenges facing us and how to realize that possibility.
I think it's important to not see us in a completely new moment right now, while also understanding the uniqueness of the moment. I think a lot of these lessons today that the panelists have brought up in the conference are important to see the actual nature of the actual contradiction at the moment, and the importance actually of a proletariat subjective force and an organization, that these things are not something that comes out of the sky, that actually involve real struggling over difference, unity through struggle, in essence. I know this is an abstraction, but the question is somewhat broad. I think there's real important forces that are in play right now that are not there in the past. The emerging Black liberation struggle is of key importance right now, I think, to everyone, and should be people should pay particular attention to how that's developing and how to join that struggle and support it, actually. These are some basic thoughts, but I'll leave it to others to talk about other.
Yeah, I think if you look at the functional role of national oppression of people of color, and especially Black people, in the history of the United States and the maintenance and reproduction of capitalist social relations in the present, in addition to, as you mentioned, the revolutionary character of the Black liberation movement, and of course it divides, and of course we don't want to just simply follow what people are saying empirically, but I think it becomes clear that Maoist politics needs to grapple with and engage with the national liberation struggle here in the United States. Now that means employing the mass line as a method of leadership in this struggle. And of course, there needs to be political organization, as you said. We can't just assume spontaneously national liberation struggle, or that by banking black, as some people advocated recently, or something like that, will solve these problems. No, I am not advocating for banking black at all, but I think really engaging with the ideas being put forward in the national liberation struggles here in the United States, as well as the working class struggles. And these two are dialectically related. The oppression serves a functional role in keeping a larger percentage of oppressed nationalities in the working class. There's really a need to grasp with that and build a principled political organization and not simply confine oneself to one single location. There's a need to actually see how these struggles play out over across the United States. And not think that a local struggle is just a local struggle. As Mao puts it very clearly, it's in the particular that the universal resides. And we need to keep that in mind at all times when doing political work, and not assume that we have understood the universal lessons of past history and simply can put them into practice now without doing concrete analysis of the classes and the social situation, the interlocking contradictions that define our present political moment.
Well, I have to jump in a little bit on this, because how you fight racism in America is that's pretty central to what's gotten me interested in and kept me interested in doing politics. You know, I'm a white guy who used to get in trouble when I was in grammar school because I grew up in the apartheid South in Jacksonville, Florida, and when the kid, you know, the other kid in the first grade would say, "Are you a Yankee or a rebel?" And I said, "My mother said that war was over 100 years ago," and then I would suffer the consequences of that wise ass answer. But, you know, the fact is, I don't think you have to be, you know, black to fight against racism. And the studies that I've done of infant death in this country make it very clear. All right, it's absolutely horrible that a black baby has 2.5 times the chance of dying as a white baby in America. It's also horrible that a white baby in America has 2.7 times the risk of dying as a baby born in Finland or Singapore. And the point is that these are not separate phenomena. These are the same thing. And we are trained in the American Public Health Association. They have a black caucus, they have a Latino caucus, they have an Asian caucus, they have a socialist caucus. The socialist caucus is all old white guys, okay? The black caucus used to be all black people, but now I'm the white guy in the black caucus. So the point is that without multiracial unity, which is really moving beyond, I think, a national liberation model, but for a class model, putting class politics primary, I don't think we can win.
I agree with that. Yeah, I really agree with that. Actually, KPFA, there was an interview of an author who published a book called From Black Lives Matters to Black Liberation. She's the first one that really related the race and class. So if you use Mao's analysis, that there are many contradictions in the United States right now, but the principal one is the major contradiction between classes. You know, unless that contradiction is resolved, you cannot move on to totally solve the race contradiction.
Just briefly, something that Abby said earlier that I really agree with is that in order for a national liberation movement to succeed, and not just to succeed maybe in secession, and not just establish another bourgeois state, of course, it needs to have a proletarian political character in leadership, not just like some. The politics have to be proletarian oriented towards liberation, towards the construction of socialism, towards the eventual abolition of all oppression. So I'm not saying, and I don't think Abby was saying earlier either, that we should just examine national oppression at a distance from class. No, it has to be dialectically related to it. It's really a question of grasping, although the principal contradiction in capitalism overall and even the United States is class, that in certain moments, in certain locales, in certain specific struggles, other contradictions can become primary. So in seeing how that local or particular contradiction relates to the larger contradictions within the country, within the world, that's the essential lesson of Mao's work even as early as, again, 1937, or realistically before it really put forward a non-contradiction in 1937.
And I want to actually respond to your question by saying that here we have a wonderful historical example, which is Anne. And people like Anne who went to China during a very difficult time in the US and China. And then they were able to actually go across boundaries. And then, therefore, I think that any kind of changes, we need to remember people who have done that before and continue to do that. Every time when I actually have probably, occasion to ask her a question, I always say, why do you do what you did? And then she always, doesn't want to say answers, right? But her new book was said it's a principle of life, right? It's not difficult. It's not difficult to do what she did, right? But you need to have principles, right? And once you are driven by your principle, right, and all other contradictions can actually be not so prominent.
The struggle goes on.
I wanted to go back to the question about Mao and the environment or ecology. In giving it considerable thought, I'm thinking about Naomi Klein's title of her book, This Changes Everything. And I think it's a key question we have to ask ourselves at this time. When you see the refugee crisis, you see capitalism crashing and burning all around you, you see all these symptoms, but the elephant in the room is climate change. And I think about Mao's, the notion of communalism. I guess, and I'm not a Mao scholar by any means, but it seems to me that at some level he's recognizing we're all one, we're all equal. The stuff about class and power and all that are all problems. And but I think that when you see disasters increasing with frequency, and I used to work in the disaster business, disaster recovery and response, the divisions of class and rich and all that go away in a disaster, in a crisis, to some extent, not totally.
I would say the opposite. They're exacerbated to a greater degree. If you have a crisis scenario, look at Katrina. The class and racial differences didn't go away. Who got to leave the city? Who was forced to stay in the city and starve or die of thirst or die from disease? I think it's quite the opposite, in fact. And on the question of Naomi Klein, in her most recent book, really the question that's front and center there for her that she's not really able to answer is the question of political organization. She says that through a number of people engaging in left adventurous actions, chaining themselves up to stop a bulldozer here or there, like the blockadia, she calls it, that will somehow stop this. The reality is that, as you've seen over and over and over again with these environmentalist actions, is that the repressive state apparatus is exorbitant in power, and a few people chaining themselves to a bulldozer or blocking a pipeline is not enough by itself to stop it. You can stop something here or there, sometimes have some successes, without a qualitative change in the mode of production and the social relations under capitalism. That is to say, if we don't establish a dictatorship of the proletariat and work towards communism, there's no real possibility of dealing with the contradictions that are emerging because of climate change.
Can I share that 2 days last week, China has 2 electric car companies that came to San Francisco and sponsored with a lot of American-based environmentalists, the China-US New Energy Economy Forum. And they had the overview by Stephen Chu and by other real scientists about the global effects of climate change and how much needs to be done soon. So give it 7 to 16 years on it.
If I could briefly respond too. I think it's not wrong to, of course, get engaged in class struggle because of the awareness of the catastrophe caused by the capitalist class and causing ecological disaster. But I agree that that's a starting point that needs to be encouraged, but it's not the end point, because it's important to also realize that many people today are saying that this is that right now, for the first time, class is no longer so important, actually, that we're actually all the same, or we don't have a Fordist economy, so therefore now we have downtimes from work and everything, and this is a unique moment, so there's no class contradiction. And not to say that you're saying that, but there are those who are, and I think it's there have been catastrophes before of immense scale as well, and not to say they're the same, but this is a repeating part of capitalist system. It's not, doesn't change everything. But the moment is always changing, I think is one way to see it.
I agree with everybody's statements. I guess what I wanted to clarify was that, yes, it's true that you see all these problems in the response to a disaster. As you said, people getting shot, people drowning, all that. Katrina's poster child. I don't disagree. I guess what I'm saying is that it could get so bad that it could be the great leveler, where differences in class and economic power and all that will not be as seen as important and as such an overriding factor in guiding our fate and making decisions about how we wish to live on the earth, and are we going to survive, or are we going to extinct ourselves and all other species? Something like that. I'm not being that eloquent, but maybe you get where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I just, following up along that line, I think in all these struggles, whether it's environmental disasters, racial oppression, everything, we communists and people that have had an opportunity to study, academics, the average worker doesn't have time to do the studies that some of the people on this panel have done. We have to help raise the level of consciousness, bring communist ideas, Marxist ideas to every struggle. For example, the football player won't salute the flag, won't sing the anthem. Instead, he gets down on his knee, right? Says, hell with it. But then he hasn't had the opportunity to take it all the way, right? Where he's going with this idea. It's a great, I even wrote a leaflet saluting Kaepernick, and we should support him. But he said, well, the bourgeoisie chimed in, and other people said, well, the U.S. soldiers are fighting for Kaepernick's right to say what he said. So I stuck in my belief. It's just an example of what activists can do, Marxist activists might be able to do. The U.S. soldiers are not fighting for our rights. The U.S. soldiers are in the Middle East, for example, as an imperialist agency, right? To oppress the people of the Middle East, to exploit the workers of the Middle East. That they're not fighting for anybody's rights. I mean, these are the kinds of ideas we can bring to a good struggle, whether it's against environmental disaster or against racism. Bring advanced ideas to good struggles.
I touch on that. I got another question from the internet that asks, the GPRC is often conceived of here as principally a youth movement. What should be the relationship between revolutionary young people and people of older generations?
This come back to what I was just saying. We should distinguish between being defeated and failed. An old revolutionary said, we were being defeated. We were defeated. Now we bend down, providing our backs for the young revolutionaries to step on to move forward. So that has to be generation after generation. I mean, old people get too old and then die, right? But they have done something to provide something for the young revolutionaries.
I just think it's also important to realize that what the person who, I don't know your name, spoke up about linking up and going beyond one's kind of status, that there's a need to get beyond some boundaries too. And there was a lot of examples in the Cultural Revolution of young revolutionaries really learning from older revolutionaries. It wasn't the case that everybody over a certain age was counter-revolutionary at all. And people really were very open about that. And talking to veterans of the revolutionary struggle, workers, this was essential to it as well. Of course, there's a need for new experience and, also the optimism of youth, of course, but good ideas are good ideas, at least from the proletarian class standpoint.
One last question also from the internet, different person. How important is it for Maoists to get the actual causes of capitalist economic crises correct versus simply bringing a communist outlook to the masses?
Simply.
Well, I think bringing the communist aspect to the masses is the way, and maybe because I'm, I have trouble understanding a lot of the more subtle things about economics and so forth, but to me, I'm reminded of there's a scene in 10 Days That Shook the World where there's an argument, a debate between this guy who's like a factory worker or a peasant, I'm not sure, but anyway, he's got a gun and he's guarding the front of some building. And a student comes up and starts arguing with him about how it was really, Lenin is doing a terrible thing by supporting the Germans by not being sufficiently patriotic or whatever. And the young Bolshevik worker says to him, well, I can't understand all of the things that you're saying, and I don't know all the details of that history, but it seems to me there's two classes, really. There are the capitalists, and then there's the workers. And we need to do what we can to support the workers. Then the student comes back with another long list of complicated arguments, which are very sophisticated and probably well-intentioned. And the worker keeps going back to, yes, that's all true, and it makes a lot of sense, and you sound very intelligent, but it seems to me that there are two classes. There's the capitalist class and there's the working class. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little simplistic myself, but I think that if we keep those politics primary, we'll end up going the right way.
Right, agreed.
I think that's a good story, and I think it's a good point to keep in mind the contradictions of capitalism. But I also think at the heart of that question is really the question of the relation between theory and practice. And at certain times, I think that really communists should strive to have a concrete understanding of the functioning of capitalism as Marx outlines it in Capital, and as others have elaborated, Lenin really talking about imperialism too is a very important text. But of course, there are certain political needs of the moment that at times can supersede the need to study something. But the key is that political organization itself has to sustain the dialectical relation between theory and practice. That it can't be a few individuals who do theoretical study and tell members of the masses what to do. And you can't liquidate the question of theory altogether and just say, well, just do practice because we need to do stuff. At times, there's a need to see there's always a need to see the dialectical relation between the two and how one can become primary. But also, again, under socialism, things really do open up in meaningful ways to really allow for putting the question of theoretical study by the members of all members of the broad masses front and center. And I think you really see that in the GPCR. With the worker study teams, with the engagement of workers and peasants in the factory and the schools, and the sending down of the students and intellectuals to the fields and to the factories to learn from that. I think that's really crucial. And those are lessons, although we can't apply them on the same scale because we don't live under a dictatorship of the proletariat, those are lessons we should take seriously today in the present in our practice.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
Almost.